What's going on, U.S. history people? This is Mr. Norris.
And Mr. Lawrence.
And we are here to cover one of the most important units in American history, launch of a new nation. We're covering from Washington to Monroe, so let's get going. All right, we're going to start off talking about constitutional actions and customs. And we'll first talk about two very important ideas when it comes to the Constitution, and that is strict versus loose interpretations. Mr. Lawrence, can you tell us what those are, please?
We've been spending some time talking about the Constitution. Now we're starting to look at the Constitution in action and looking at some historical events around it. But when understanding the Constitution, it's important to understand two ideologies that develop around it, the idea of a strict and a loose interpretation. A strict interpretation is this idea of reading the Constitution word for word. So if you don't see something in it, that means the government can't do it. The loose interpretation is trying to see the Constitution almost as a living document, saying that it needs to adapt with changes and shifts within society in order to make the Constitution relevant for over 200 years.
And that's a great point, and something to keep in mind. Many people who favor the loose interpretation, certainly Alexander Hamilton early on, will point to something called the elastic clause, which is also known as the necessary and proper clause, which allows Congress to make laws about things that are not specifically stated in the Constitution. It allows them to keep up with a change in times. Okay, another idea that sticks around is the two-term tradition, and what president first did 2 terms and then quit?
Was that George Washington?
It was Washington. This is going to be a tradition for a very long time until somebody comes along and ruins it by being elected 4 times. Who is that person?
That is FDR.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt is correct. By the way, what amendment made it so a person could only run for president 2 times?
Was it the 22nd Amendment?
22nd. And I teach this as 2-term 22. 2-term 22. 22 2 terms.
All right, so another action or custom that we see that are that's been part of our new government, part of the Constitution, but not specifically delegated or written out, is the issue of lobbying. We see this is something that we still deal with in 2013 and will probably be dealing with years into the future. The idea that certain interest groups will be able to access our Congress or our legislative branch in order to really promote certain ideas or to promote certain philosophies and how laws should be created.
Yeah, I always use the example of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, as a lobbyist group. So they spend a lot of time with Congress people, donate money to their campaigns to help their interests, which are less restrictive gun laws, be taken into effect.
And guys, we have to realize there's lobbyists for hundreds, if not thousands, of groups. Another custom or tradition that we see during this time period is the development of the presidential cabinet, something that, again, very important to this day, but develops under Washington, not specifically stated in the Constitution. And again, Mr. Norris, when we talk about a presidential cabinet, do we mean an actual piece of furniture that the president has in his office?
Sadly, no. We're talking about a group of people here. I always use the analogy as if you think about a school, and the principal is the president of the school. The cabinet could be different department chair members. So like the social studies department has somebody who's in charge of that, the department chair. The science department does. So if the principal wants advice on a certain department, they would probably go to the department chair first to get advice. So for example, the State Department has a Secretary of State, the Treasury Department has a Secretary of Treasury.
And one of the last actions or customs that we see start to develop at this time period is the issue of judicial review. Very important that we understand this idea that judicial review isn't specifically stated within the Constitution. It's something that really the Supreme Court gives itself as a power to determine constitutionality of presidential actions and laws created by Congress.
Okay, let's talk about the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And he had 4 parts of his plan to improve the U.S. economy that you need to be familiar with. And the first one is this idea of the assumption of debt. And particularly, he wanted the national government to assume all of the state debt. So if, for example, Massachusetts had a lot of debt, which they did during this time, the federal government would take on that debt and then pay it off. So every state, they would assume their debt.
Well, hold on for a second, Mr. Norris. So are you telling me that Alexander Hamilton actually wanted the federal government to be in debt? Is this something... Did he consider debt a good thing?
He absolutely did. Great point. He did consider debt to be a good thing. He believed that the more the country was in debt, the more people wanted the country to succeed, at least until they could pay it back.
Very interesting. Now, was this a controversial topic, this Hamilton plan, or this issue of good debt?
Without question, yes. Many people did not support his plan, and this is actually going to help to develop into two different political parties, the Federalist and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, we will see.
Interesting. All right, so I know there's the assumption of debt, now also the issue of the national bank. This idea that Hamilton believed that the federal government would need a financial institution to help the American people grow the economy, whether it was providing loans, providing a safe place for people to invest their money. But again, is the national bank, is it inside the Constitution? Is there anything in the Constitution that allows for a national bank?
There is not, and Hamilton was a loose interpreter, which meant that anything the Constitution did not say you could do, that means you could do that. So he is the one who argues that the elastic clause gives the government the power to create the national bank. And Thomas Jefferson will not agree with him, and this will help lead to the political parties that I just mentioned.
So our third topic in his plan was an excise tax. And an excise tax is just a tax on domestically produced goods. One example we'll see is a tax placed on, do you remember a certain drink that they were placed on?
I believe it was whiskey.
That's right, which will lead to a rebellion, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But again, a controversial issue, taxing domestically made goods, especially when taxation was such a big part of the reason the United States gained its independence in the first place.
Now, Mr. Lawrence, you mentioned the word domestic. Can you remind me what domestic means here?
That's a really good question. We always talk about domestic and foreign policy issues. Domestic, again, are issues that happen within the border of the United States. Foreign, issues dealing with foreign countries or issues outside the United States.
So an excise tax would be a tax on domestically manufactured goods. In other words, goods that are made in the United States. We'll finish up with a tariff, which is the opposite of an excise tax. And a tariff is a tax on foreign goods or imported goods. So American businesses will like this because it'll drive up the price of foreign goods, and the government will also like this. Why would the government like tariffs?
Well, it's going to allow the federal government to actually gain revenues, and then we will have money within the Treasury and allow the federal government to do things like raise an army or to provide certain programs. So again, ladies and gentlemen, just remember the financial plan, we have, sometimes we refer to it as BEAT. So B for bank, E for excise tax, A for assumption of debt, and finally T for, what's the T for, Mr. Norris?
Tariff, a tax on imported or foreign goods. All right, let's talk about Hamilton versus Jefferson. We've set the stage for these two. Hamilton, as I mentioned, is a Federalist. This is the political party now, and they believe in a very strong central government. He was also the first Treasury Secretary in United States history appointed by George Washington, and he favored an economy based on manufacturing, which will also lead him to be pro-British because he envisions the United States trading those goods with the British. So we're talking about what Hamilton is. Jefferson, we'll see, is the opposite in many ways.
That's right. So we see this development of two different ideologies, one with the Federalists and Hamilton and the other with Jefferson and what becomes known as the Democratic Republicans. So Jefferson was pretty much the opposite. He was the first Secretary of State. He believed in an economy based on agriculture. So a difference too is Hamilton receives a lot of his support from the wealthier elites within American society. Jefferson, even though he's a very well-educated, wealthy man himself, finds much of his support with the working class or the agricultural class. And he also sees support with the French. He believed the French provided us support during our revolution, we should then in turn support the French during their revolution. So two strong divisions develop within Washington's first cabinet.
Okay, let's talk about Washington and his presidency. One thing that happens in 1789 is the Judiciary Act, and this creates the Supreme Court. And we will talk more about the Supreme Court in just a minute. We also have a rebellion called the Whiskey Rebellion, which was in response to the excise tax. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion is quickly crushed, as you can see Washington down here. And Alexander Hamilton is on the horse right here. He marched with Washington. It quickly crushes this rebellion and shows the power of the new central government under the Constitution.
So a few other things to remember about Washington: the Proclamation of Neutrality. A big issue with Washington, as a military leader, he was fearful that the United States would be pulled into more conflict, and he was aware that we as a new nation were not very strong militarily and could be pulled into conflict, which could really put our new independence at risk with the British or the French.
And finally, the foreign policy really ties in with the neutrality there. The idea that the U.S. should stay neutral in foreign affairs, particularly when Britain and France were fighting each other in the late 1700s, early 1800s. We're going to talk about the growth of federal power. And a lot of it can be traced back to this guy down here, John Marshall. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1798, we had the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed under the administration of John Adams. This made it tougher for foreigners to be U.S. citizens, and it also made it illegal to criticize the U.S. government. I thought you could criticize the government, though.
Well, that's one kind of contradiction about these laws. The First Amendment protects your freedom of speech, specifically political speech. So this made some people very uncomfortable with these Alien Sedition Acts. But
okay, let's go on to the Marshall Court, led by the guy in the bottom, John Marshall. A few things to keep in mind. When it comes to John Marshall, the power of the federal government increases. Let me say that again. The power of the federal government is going to increase. And we will see this under Marbury versus Madison, a court case you mentioned, Mr. Lawrence, earlier, that established the principle of judicial review, which allows the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional. Then we have Gibbons versus Ogden, which states that Congress is the only group that can control interstate trade or trade between states. So this gives more power to the federal government. Then we have McCulloch versus Maryland, and this deals with the second bank of the United States. Maryland was trying to tax the bank, and it goes to the Supreme Court, and John Marshall says absolutely, positively, no, you cannot do that, Maryland. You are bad. Don't try that again. And this gives more power to the federal government. And in the case of Gibbons and McCulloch, both come at the expense of states.
so again, ladies and gentlemen, remember, Marshall Court, more power to the federal government. All right, so next we have Thomas Jefferson as president. So our third president of the United States is Jefferson. Again, someone who believed in a reduction of the federal government. When he comes to power, he's going to look to shrink the size of the military. He's going to look to cut taxes. But one unique aspect about his presidency is he takes the opportunity to buy the Louisiana Territory. So with the Louisiana Purchase, he will double the size of the United States in one swoop. A $15 million check written to Napoleon doubles the size of the United States, which is unique because he kind of exercises his presidential power, something that he was against for a long time, in order to try and benefit the U.S. We see the Lewis and Clark expedition will be put together in order to explore this new territory and push west and help to push for westward expansion. And finally, we have the Embargo Act, an act set up to try and deal with the issue of impressment of sailors. Jefferson will push Congress to completely outlaw any foreign trade with any foreign nation and really shut down all ports within the United States. Now, Mr. Norris, the Embargo Act was set up to hurt foreign nations, but who did it really hurt?
It destroyed the U.S. economy. It really hurt a lot of people, merchants who base their careers off of trading. So it definitely hurt the U.S. economy. Now, talking about the Embargo Act and the Louisiana Purchase, I've read the Constitution several times, and nowhere in there does it say that the president can do either of these. So what does this mean about Jefferson's view of the Constitution? He goes from what was a strict interpreter to
more of a loose interpretation. We see Jefferson as a president really starts to change his political philosophies once he actually has to govern. So he had very strict beliefs, but once he's in the presidency, things start to change.
All right, we'll finish it up with foreign policy in the War of 1812. So let's talk about some of the causes of the War of 1812. We have tensions with Great Britain. You mentioned the word impressment. That is essentially the kidnapping of Americans and making them join the British Navy. There is impressment there. We also have war hawks, as just mentioned, and war hawks like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, people from the South and the West who were adamant that Britain should be punished for their violations.
All right, so some quick effects. The War of 1812 is a 3-year conflict with really no clear winner. Both sides kind of come together and decide, you know what, we need to come to a peace. You see the growth of the American manufacturing because trade with Britain is pretty much non-existent when you're fighting a war against them. You see the reduction of the Federalist influence within government because they spoke out strongly against the war. You see the burning of Washington, D.C. once the British invade the American homeland. And finally, you do see the Battle of New Orleans, which actually takes place after the Treaty of Ghent, but it does play an important role for really pushing forward a prominent American leader, Andrew Jackson.
He issues something called the Monroe Doctrine, and we see a cartoon down in the bottom right-hand corner, and there's Uncle Sam, or James Monroe, basically saying to Europe, stay out of Latin America. During this time, Latin America experienced many revolutions and overthrew a lot of the European monarchs, and Monroe told Europe, you stay over there in your hemisphere, and we will stay over here. All right, that's everything you need to know about launching a new nation. Hope this video helped. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day, guys.